Welcome back, Review a Day, episode number. Who really gives a shit at this point? My name is Leland, and thank you so much for joining me. Review a Day Unplugged still continues. I think it's probably going to stay this way. You know what? Honestly, the lighting is better in here than it ever was in the other room, so I think it feels like a nice fit, and this is where I'm going to be staying. The movie review I'm going to be doing for you guys today is this new George Clooney flick that just came out, The American. This movie is directed by Anton Corbijn, a guy who directed a couple years back, directed the Joy Division Ian Curtis movie, Control, which a movie I didn't love. It was a very kind of by-the-numbers biopic. Biopics put me to sleep as it is. But if there was one thing I did take away from watching Control, was that Anton Corbijn was a director who knew how to shoot a movie incredibly well. This new movie that he has, The American, starring George Clooney, Paolo Bonicelli, Violente Placido, and Irina Bjorklund. You guys liking those pronunciations? George Clooney, if you haven't seen the trailer, he's playing this kind of cold, calculated assassin who can modify guns so they can fit into like a Pringles can and they can bust it out and straight up assassinate someone. And he gets hired to do kind of this one last job. There's an attractive woman who's hiring him to make this gun that can fit into a briefcase so she can take some dudes out. All the while, George Clooney is kind of having these interesting conversations with a priest nearby, and he's kind of opening up to him. And he also kind of starts falling in love with the kind of the prostitute with the heart of gold. The American is an incredibly thoughtful, slow-paced, and very hypnotic film. If you're going into this expecting an action movie where you're going to have George Clooney running around Europe and maybe getting behind the wheel of an Audi and running people over and taking, kicking ass and taking aims, that is not what this movie is. This is much more of a character piece than anything else. This movie, I think, is more about where George Clooney's character, this cold, calculated assassin, where he is in his life. It's much more about that than it is him actually successfully pulling off an assassination attempt or actually getting this final job done. This movie is very slow paced, and I think a lot of people will not enjoy this movie. I really I love Wendy and Lucy, but I know so many people who watch that and go, nothing happened. And I think there's going to be a good amount of people who will walk out of The American and say, nothing happened. And, I think that is on one hand fair to say, but I watched this movie and I thought it was, on one hand, being very hypnotic, and I think a movie where nothing happens, but I think it was also very suspenseful. I think if you invest in this movie, I think there is a lot of suspense to be found. That very early on, I think the movie, Anton Corbijn is the entire movie just looks gorgeous. Anton Corbijn he has a great eye for film. And early on in the movie, George Clooney kind of rolls up into this little European village, and he's walking around, and he's kind of just taking everything in. And I think you can on one hand say, yeah, it's just George Clooney walking around and nothing's happening yet. But when I watch that scene, to me, it's putting you in the shoes of George Clooney, where in that sequence, he was taking in all of these different locations throughout the village, and he's checking out vantage points, and he's making sure that he isn't being followed. And the fact that he's walking around, and then later on in the film, when he's so cleverly kind of getting from one area to another, I went, okay, well, that makes sense, because that's who this guy is. And I think George Clooney gives a wonderful performance in this movie. I love George Clooney and everything he does, pretty much. I love his his kind of up in the air performances where he's kind of just doing a Cary Grant, really charming, smiling a lot performance. Here, I think he's a little bit more restrained, and I think he's really, really great in it. I think he does like Robert Duvall did in Get Low. I think he does a lot of acting just with those chops. And how does George Clooney get better looking with every movie he does? It seems like the guy, when he kind of was on ER, he was ridiculously handsome, but he's somehow even better looking now. Is that gay of me to say? I don't think it is, because I think everyone gets George Clooney. The guy's awesome in this movie. I thought the entire cast across the board was really nice. And I think this movie does walk that line of being artsy-fartsy movie where nothing happens, balanced out with some legitimate payoffs. I think you do get your fair share of what you were kind of looking for if you were looking for a suspense thriller. And I also think it walks the line of being a little cliche, where he's this kind of lone calculated killer, and the only thing that could ever get him to change his way is the prostitute with a heart of gold. But I think the script is really nice and restrained. I especially liked all of the scenes of dialogue between George Clooney and the priest. I thought were really, really nice. And I think there's some moments where it could have gone over to be a little overreaching, but I think the way they're played out and the situations that they happen in are really, really nice. I'm bouncing back between a 4 and a 5. I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. I really do highly recommend you check out The American, but be prepared for some pretty slow, thoughtful filmmaking. I really quite enjoyed it. It was a nice change of pace. If you like this review, make sure to head over to nitpickit.com or dampercast.com. Maybe there'll be a new episode up. Thank you guys so much, and I'll catch you guys next time.